Jeon Dae-Sik, the old assassin, was supposed to be dead. Not officially. Those papers were burned long ago, but in every way that mattered. Seoul buried men like me under medals and silence. But I didn't stay buried. Not when the things I hunted kept crawling back. I wasn't trained for demons, but they came anyway. Now I take contracts from the dead. Last night in Gongdeok-dong, they called again. A girl trapped in an empty apartment needs to be rescued, and I have to go even if I am old for the job. They say evil hides in the woods, in castles, in ancient stone. Fairy tales are wrong. Real evil sleeps under apartment blocks. It waits in fluorescent hallways and behind doors that don't get mail anymore. The worst thing I ever saw started here, Gongdeok-dong, Seoul, 2002. One of those nowhere places in the city, sandwiched between redevelopment zones and failed real estate dreams. It had all the charm of a broken tooth. Gongdeok-dong didn't make the news much. No tourists, no temples, no scandals, just rusted fences, crumbling rooftops, and a concrete sprawl left over from the dictatorship days. The kind of neighborhood that looked underdeveloped, wasted, and ignored by the higher-ups. I came here because the Nokia rang twice at 2:03 a.m. and then stopped. The old code from the agency. The kind you only hear if the job involves non-human escalation. The building had no name, just a street number, 17-4, scratched into rusted steel beside the door. A tenement built in '68, condemned in '99, and still full of people who didn't have the luxury of moving elsewhere. I always thought death would feel colder, but tonight, it was my knees that went first, again, grinding like shattered porcelain beneath aging muscle and half-healed bone. Every step up that rain-slick alley felt like dragging a casket behind me. Probably mine. It's hard to write my story, or even to share to someone sane. You know, in our line of work there is no official retirement. If you're lucky, it's a peaceful death. We are the chosen ones, chosen to do a job, but not to question, and I know that is not the way of a democratic world, but it's a choice anyway. We are born for this. They say when a man survives too much, he stops living. I didn't survive. I just refused to die. My heart kept ticking, stubborn bastard that it was, and the world didn't have the decency to bury me with the rest of my unit. When there were still deaths crawling around in the shadows. When the government still wanted certain things erased without fingerprints. I lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. Not for the nicotine. That pleasure died years ago when they carved sigils into my lungs, but for the flicker of heat. Fire reveals things. Smoke hides them. And when the flame bent sideways, toward the building instead of the sky, I knew. This place was breathing. The alley was a wet lung. Every surface gleamed with monsoon sweat, the rusted gutters, the broken neon signs humming in epileptic spurts, the trash piled against alley walls like something had burrowed through it. The gutters burped a thick stench, mold, urine, fish oil, and burnt plastic. This wasn't the Seoul you saw on travel guides. This was the underbelly, the part of the city that bled quietly while the rich danced above. Overhead, the apartment block loomed, a rotting monolith of communist ambition. A dozen rows of concrete mouths stacked on top of each other, breathing steam and shadows. Electrical wires sagged like veins. I counted them out of habit. 6 were frayed. 2 had tape wrapped around them, and 1 sparked faintly every 8 seconds. That number again. A woman's voice wailed from a window 2 floors above, or maybe it was a cat. It didn't matter. No one opened windows here for fresh air, only for letting things out. I passed a payphone half melted from an old fire. On its glass was a prayer scrawled in red ink, "Deliver us from the voice under Seoul." Someone had circled it. Someone else had crossed it out. It was the kind of street that echoed with sins long after the screaming stopped. Behind me, a dog barked. 3 short bursts, then silence. I paused. Always count the barks. 1 for warning, 2 for fear. 3, that's when something unnatural has already passed through. The streetlights above flickered like old war radios trying to speak in Morse code. Most people don't notice that kind of thing. I do. I spent too long in places where light meant survival, or the exact opposite. I flicked the cigarette to the wet ground and crushed it beneath my heel. No need for warmth now. The air had gone still. The building in front of me was 11 stories of concrete and regret. The walls leaked mildew. The steel entrance door was half open, not welcoming, just tired. A low hum came from the stairwell, almost human, like someone breathing slow and deep behind the concrete. I didn't flinch. I reached into my coat, pulled the cloth pouch around my neck, and felt the pinch of Namhe ash inside. Still warm, but a bad sign. I took the stairs. Apartment 404. Death number. I knocked once. The door creaked open an inch. No sign of wind, neither any footsteps. Inside, the hallway was dark, but I didn't need light. The smell struck first, not rot or blood, something worse. Like a funeral home mixed with steamed rice, incense ash, and wet leather. The smell of faith curdled by time. There was salt across the threshold. Broken deliberately. That meant someone invited this in. The wallpaper peeled like burnt skin. Protective sigils were carved into it, but they'd been scratched through. 3 dolls hung by thread from the kitchen cabinet. Mouths sewn, eyes dug out. The kind of folk magic meant to absorb trauma, but these had been gutted from the inside. The living room fan spun with no power. Its blades moved slow, steady. In the hallway, blood shimmered like lacquered paint. A trail, small footprints. Then drag marks. The girl was in the bathtub. Empty bathtub without any water. Just silence. And the humming, that soft, broken melody coming from her lips. A tune I'd heard before. Her knees were to her chest. Her eyes fixed on the wall like it was bleeding. She was soaked, though everything else was dry. Her skin was smudged with ash. Fingernails packed with it. Not dirt, ash. Her mother's corpse lay face down in front of the tub. The blood markings around her suggested a failed ward, or worse, a ritual that succeeded too well. The bathroom was a cathedral of silence. I crouched down, every vertebra in my back aching. My joints hurt. But I didn't care, because I saw her face then. And for half a second, it was my daughter's. My daughter. She would have been about the same age. Same round cheeks. Same tiny hands folded like they were keeping secrets. She used to hum too, when the night got too heavy. When I came home smelling like exorcism oil and sulfur. When I promised her the monsters were gone. But they weren't. She was taken during the Bake to mission. 1993. A ritual gone wrong. A summoning that opened something dark. We were sent in to contain it. Only 4 of us made it out. I left her behind. They told me she screamed until the mountain swallowed the sound. I hadn't spoken her name in years. Now this girl, this stranger, had her eyes. I reached for her. She flinched like an innocent child out of instinct. I asked, "Are you Cha Minha?" She didn't answer, just looked past me and pointed. When I was 27, we buried a girl in Bulgaria. She'd been taken, same signs, same ash, same humming. We were told it was a Soviet experiment gone rogue. Some Cold War psychic leftovers, stitched together from scraps of Stasi, KGB, and American deep tech. Back then, we still believed it was all mechanical, gas, hypnosis, trauma triggers. But then she spoke Latin backwards in a dialect that predates Christ. Then her blood turned gray in the moonlight. And then she smiled at us. I watched 3 of my men lose their minds that night. 1 shot himself. 1 simply sat down in the snow and died. The last one, Park Hyun, he lasted until 2001. We used to meet once a year, just to sit in silence. When he finally talked again, it was to tell me, they're not experiments. They're prophecies. He died a week later, found in a Seoul subway station. No wounds, no soul left inside. Like something scooped him out and left the shell. So when I walked through Gongdaek's alleys with the humming girl and felt the rain turn to ash, I didn't panic. I didn't run. I just knew it was happening again. She stopped humming as we turned the last corner. The silence was sharp. Not empty, expectant. The ash was falling thicker now, clinging to my gloves, smudging against the leather of my coat. I wiped my sleeve, felt the grime smear. The girl's clothes were spotless, untouched. It wasn't a metaphor. The ash avoided her. I checked my phone, again. Still dead. Not low battery. Just lifeless. That happens when a gate is nearby. My shoulder flared, the old wound from Hokkaido lighting up again. The job had been simple. Black-robed priest suspected of ritual crimes. No evidence, just whispers. I put a round in his skull. But something followed me home. Every time a gate stirs, that scar burns. We passed an abandoned fish market. The windows were still broken from a fire 20 years ago. I caught a glint behind the glass. Movement, but not human. Thin. Jerking. Observing. She didn't turn to look. She already knew. I took us under the old industrial rail line. The bridge never connected to anything. It was a Cold War escape route, built for shadow agents if Seoul ever fell. My unit used to stage surveillance under there. Back when we thought monsters were just metaphors. Behind the boiler house, we reached the door. Flat steel, painted gray to match the wall. I hadn't touched it in a decade. I stared at my hand before placing it against the sigil. Burnt into concrete with 4 men's blood. Kim Ribe and mine, all gone now. The last time I saw them was here, dragging a screaming child into that chapel, praying we could stop what had already begun. The sigil pulsed beneath my palm, once, then again. The door groaned open. The chapel was colder than I remembered. Damp crept along the walls like moss. There were no candles, no power, no signs of recent use. Just silence and rot. The girl walked ahead. I followed, eyes sweeping each pew, each corner. That's when I saw her. A woman crumpled at the base of the altar. Neck snapped, blood soaked into the floorboards like it had been there for hours. The girl didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood beside the body, tilting her head as if trying to remember who the woman had been, as if the girl knew this kind of violence all along. I stepped closer. The woman's eyes were open. Her mouth to a half-spoken word frozen there. Maybe run, maybe just breath. I checked her pulse anyway. Cold, no rigor yet, time of death recent. Something upstairs was on fire. The girl looked up as I did. It's spreading, she said calmly. I grabbed her wrist. We're leaving. She didn't resist. She just looked back once. She didn't mean to open it. What? The book? It was already open. No more questions. We exited through the side. Smoke had reached the stairwell by the time we hit ground level again. No alarms. No fire crews. Just that creeping burn smell chasing us down the corridor. Outside, the ash had stopped falling. The wind picked up, not heavy, but directional. Like it was pushing us forward. We didn't speak again until we reached the street. She turned to me and said, "You didn't save me. You just showed up late." I had no reply. Because she was right. How can I save another child when I couldn't even save my own daughter? The streets of Gongdaek looked different after the fire. Not because they had changed, they hadn't. Same cracked sidewalks, same idle neon flickering from broken windows, but because I'd seen something inside the chapel that couldn't be unseen. Not the girl. Not even the corpse. It was her silence. That silence stuck with me more than any ritual or bullet ever had. It wasn't fear. It was memory. Something deeper, older, and much harder to explain. It felt like she'd been through this before, not the night, but the pattern. She hadn't said much since we left. We walked for nearly 20 minutes through side streets that only delivery drivers and drunks knew. I led her down narrow paths that wrapped around convenience stores and half-demolished karaoke bars. She never asked where we were going. I'm not sure she cared. The city didn't look at her the way it looked at everyone else. Like she didn't belong, not in a hostile way, but like it didn't register her existence at all. When we reached the edge of Mapo, I flagged down a taxi the old-fashioned way. Just my hand out under a flickering lamp. An older driver stopped, glanced at me, then at the girl, and didn't ask a thing. That's why I picked him. We rode mostly in silence, save for the crackle of the driver's radio tuned to an AM channel I hadn't heard in years. There was an old trot song playing, something my father used to hum when he was half asleep. I asked her if she wanted food. She shook her head. "I'm not hungry yet," she said. We reached Yangdongpo in just under 20 minutes. I took her through an alley beside an old bookstore, one of the few safe houses I still kept active. The shop had changed owners, but not purpose. It had been a drop zone during the late 80s, back when cross-border psyops weren't just theory. The basement door was sealed behind a row of stacked hardcovers and a copy of The Secret History of North Asia, spine cracked and faded with dust. Inside, the concrete bunker had papers. That was intentional. Old books masked scent signatures better than bleach. We stepped down a metal staircase and entered the old staging room. I clicked the manual switch on the far wall. Light flickered and stayed steady. The girl stood in the center of the room and looked around like someone who'd been there before. "This room looks mysterious," she said. I opened a sealed case in the far cabinet. Inside were my old tools, burner phones wrapped in copper mesh, cassette tapes of classified debriefs, 3 handguns I hadn't touched in over a decade, and a series of notebooks bound in stitched leather. I hadn't looked at them since I quit. I pulled out a photo of my old team. Bae Kim, Ri Park Hyun and myself. We were younger than we should have been, and older than we looked. We thought we were hardened men, but we had no idea how deep things went. The girl walked over slowly. She pointed at Ri. "He died first." I turned to her. "Be careful. Who told you that?" She blinked. "No one. I just know." I didn't argue. There was no point. I burned through one of the burner phones, battery still charged, surprisingly, and dialed a code I hadn't used in years. The call bounced through 6 international proxies and ended in static. That was the protocol. I tried it twice before. Once in 2003 after a failed op in Vladivostok, and again in 2009 when the Vatican seal failed in Busan. Static meant someone was still listening but couldn't reply. Or wouldn't. At 3:14 a.m., the girl sat up suddenly from where she'd been resting on an old cot. She said, "Something's coming tomorrow." I asked, "What kind of something?" She looked at me flatly. "Not a thing, but someone." I spent the rest of the night reviewing files I swore I'd never open again. Unresolved encounters with children who survived ritual-linked incidents. 10 documented. 11 unconfirmed. A few turned violent. A few disappeared entirely. One ended up in a French asylum drawing spiral glyphs until her death. What united them wasn't trauma. It was pattern. By sunrise, I needed air. We took the back exit. I led her through an abandoned train tunnel that hadn't been used since the Olympics. It used to be an escape route for intelligence officers should the city fall. Now it just smelled like rust and oil. She walked beside me, hands in her jacket sleeves, eyes scanning the ground. "You used to do this with someone else," she said. I didn't ask how she knew. She wasn't wrong. The last time I used that tunnel was with Ji-won. We surfaced near a bathhouse in Jongyo. I knew the owner. He owed me. We entered without questions. The girl waited in the women's locker room. I gave her space. When I came back 20 minutes later, she had drawn symbols on the mirror using the condensation. Not Hangul, not Chinese, not Latin, something I'd seen in the Siberian briefings. I snapped a photo and sent it through a dead drop line to one of my old linguist contacts. No read receipt or replies are awaited. I looked at the girl again. "Why now?" I asked her. She looked through the mirror at my reflection and said, "You lost someone like me. And now I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again." I didn't have an answer. Just a knot in my chest. We returned to the streets under a dull gray sky. Rain again, real rain. Heavy and without shape. It soaked through my coat. She stayed dry. Back in the alley, I noticed a van parked at the far end. Government plate. Lights off, engine still warm. I took her hand. "We leave now." She didn't ask. We moved. I led her through a series of underground conduits beneath the financial district. Old tunnels meant for electrical rerouting, now forgotten. We moved for 30 minutes without speaking. When we reached a maintenance hatch, I paused. "There's someone watching you," I said. She turned. "There always is." I cracked the hatch and scanned the corridor. Clear. We exited into the sub-basement of a disused metro station. I checked my pulse. It had spiked. "I'm tired," she said, weakly and just honestly. I looked at her then, really looked. She was maybe 9, 10 at most. Her clothes were too clean. Her eyes too old. Her voice not cold, but soft and innocent. Like someone who had endured things over and over, enough to know how to survive them without asking for help. "You knew she was dead when we entered the chapel, didn't you?" I asked. She nodded. "Was she really your mother?" "I think she was meant to be." And just like that, I understood more than I wanted to. This wasn't about possession. This wasn't about demons or gates or cults. It was about programming, at levels no agency had ever admitted. These children weren't born. They were designed. Grown in a time when the Cold War had fractured into unseen experiments, when the threat wasn't nuclear, but spiritual. I'd seen the documents. Back in '89. Before the facility in Karagandhi was scrubbed from satellite records. This girl was never meant to survive. And yet here she was. And someone knew. As we sat in the flickering emergency light of that abandoned station, she leaned her head against my shoulder. It wasn't affection. It was acknowledgement. "I don't want to die," she whispered. I didn't promise her anything. I just sat there. Because I had to finish what started decades ago. I had already lost one daughter. But I wasn't fucking going to lose another. You don't know what it feels like when you're an assassin who had probably murdered hundreds, if not less, without a single question or remorse. But it feels different today, like this tiny child has awoken something humane inside me. The girl hadn't spoken since the fire. Her silence didn't bother me, it was too familiar. We sat together in the remains of what used to be a utility substation, deep in the service corridors beneath Seoul. A week ago, it had been sealed by rusted bolts and a makeshift lock. The girl slept with her knees drawn up and her hand clutched tightly around a burnt scrap of coat. The flames from the apartment had barely touched her, but something else had done something that still lingered. I leaned against the wall, the cracked tiles behind me marked with old spray tags and forgotten signs from maintenance crews who had vanished decades ago. The light above us flickered without pattern. That always made me nervous. In my work, flickers usually meant a surveillance node cycling, not faulty electricity. I pulled the map out again, hand-drawn, faded, fragile. My memory guided my finger along a line through Guanagu, toward a sealed zone labeled WZ-17. I hadn't thought about that place since the end of the Cold War, since we burned every report and walked away with blood under our nails. But the girl had said something in the chapel that made my blood chill. I remember the one with no windows. That wasn't poetic. That was a place. WZ-17 wasn't just a bunker. It was a classified testing site. One of several. And the only one I'd seen firsthand. It wasn't on maps, not even in the black archives. We used to call it the hatchery. Not because life began there, because it ended differently. At dawn, I left her resting and climbed through the adjoining tunnel to reach the sealed manhole that connected the abandoned line to the perimeter of WZ-17. The bolt was still marked with the faint red slash and the letter V. I removed it with a crowbar I'd hidden in a nearby conduit box 20 years ago. The kind of paranoia that pays off once in a lifetime. The descent took 15 minutes. Steel mesh stairs. No sound but my own steps. I reached the lower floor and was hit with the smell, not rot, but preservation. Dust that had aged like meat, and the ghost of electricity still living in copper. Inside, the walls had been white once. Now they were gray with age and covered in chalk markings. Not random, Anatomical drawings, spirals, diagrams of the human body twisted into unnatural poses. Eyes drawn in clusters, symbols drawn in perfect symmetry, often repeated with increasing aggression. The hallway split at a sealed gate. I bypassed the keypad using an old manual override. I still remembered how from 1987. The steel door opened with a slow hiss. Beyond it lay the lab. The air here was unnaturally dry. Not just neglected, filtered, preserved. The facility hadn't been abandoned. It had been paused. 3 beds lined the far wall, each containing a small body, still breathing, wired into a machine system I didn't recognize. Soviet components hybridized with Korean tech. The first child's head was shaved and covered in ink symbols. The second had fused fingers and a jaw that moved in tiny spasms. The third had bandages where eyes should have been and tubes wrapped down into his chest. But the fourth bed was empty. Only the imprint remained. I scanned the equipment, dusty but powered. 1 clipboard, 1 drawer still locked. I forced it open and pulled a file labeled Subject D Class Terminations. Inside were logs, cold, unfeeling lists. Subject 4, failed temperance calibration. Executed via fluid reversal. Subject 9, uncontainable projection radius. Removed via incineration protocol. Subject 11, advanced resonance collapse. Expired mid-seizure during testing. There were dozens more. I read until the words became noise. These weren't just kids with mutations. They were shaped, broken open and rebuilt. And when they didn't work, they were erased. Just erased. 1 log chilled me. Subject 17, recovered from transport failure. Still vocal, adaptive. Subject may retain sight memory. It was marked with a faded ink stamp, Echo 2 deferred. My codename. I hadn't remembered this child. Not yet, but my codename, why was it even there? On the console I found a photo. 5 children standing in line, backs straight, heads tilted. One was her. The girl I'd pulled from the fire. She was here. She had always been here. The sound behind me, mechanical, booted. I didn't turn around. Just slipped out through the emergency tunnel, cut through a side shaft I'd charted long ago. My breath was tight. My jaw clenched. When I emerged back into the city dusk, she was waiting. Sitting on the edge of the concrete lip, arms still wrapped around that coat scrap. Her voice was flat when she spoke. You looked into the room. I nodded. She didn't ask what I saw. They always make you remember, she said. Across the street, the black van was still there. It hadn't moved. They're waiting, I said. They're bad men, she replied. They're watching. I haven't decided yet. What haven't you decided? I asked. She didn't answer. She stood and we walked. In the days that followed our escape from the station fire, something had begun to shift, not just in the air or in the way the city moved, but inside me. The weight in my chest no longer felt like the slow guilt of old operations or unspoken sins buried under layers of command. It felt sharper now, immediate, like instinct reawakening for a cause that I couldn't frame in protocol or mission parameters. That girl, who hadn't even told me her name, had become my axis. Each breath she took, each step she made beside me, steadied something raw in my bones that had been fraying since the day Seoul's alleys stopped hiding the ghosts of my past. They had called me Echo. Back in the Cold War days, when my only job was to slip into disputed territories and quietly remove anomalies, humans who had drifted too far from the acceptable frequencies of thought. That was how they described it, psychic drift. The ones with too much resonance, too much pattern-breaking capacity. The problem with them wasn't that they posed a threat in the traditional sense. It was that they couldn't be predicted, couldn't be folded into the greater narrative of global stability the agencies worked so hard to maintain. The files were thick with euphemisms, containment, recalibration, relocation, but we all knew what it meant. Elimination with a clean report. I did my part, believing I was a surgical tool for the preservation of order. But somewhere between Berlin and Irkutsk, I stopped believing in borders and started watching the pattern of manipulation wrap itself around every government like barbed wire laced with silk. I had thought my codename had died with my file when I burned it in a metal bin in Da Nang. But in that bunker, W17, her file said otherwise. Subject 17, adaptive, echo class, deferred. The term deferred in those circles didn't mean forgotten. It meant someone was still watching, grooming, waiting for the asset to mature. I hadn't expected her to be more than a victim. But the way she moved, the way her eyes scanned a room, the way she responded to silence with silence, not fear but calculation, it started to dawn on me that this wasn't an accidental meeting. This was entanglement, the recoiling of a spring set in motion decades ago. Her abilities weren't loud, weren't obvious. She didn't melt walls or lift things with her mind. What she did was far more dangerous. She observed, absorbed, reproduced. She could enter a room with 5 different people and leave understanding who would betray whom first, how to dismantle their alliances, and which pressure points would silence each one. Not because she read their minds, but because she understood behavior, tone, rhythm, and history with uncanny depth. She had spent her early years inside structures built for silence. In those underground labs, language wasn't taught through repetition, but through exposure to surveillance footage of operations, training tapes from the special forces, voice logs from operatives during field assignments. They let her echo men like me until her instincts mirrored ours. That explained why she responded to my questions before I asked them, why she kept her back to walls, why she never crossed thresholds until I did. She had memorized me, or someone like me. We were in Itaewon when the van appeared again. I had noticed it 3 blocks back. A black Daihatsu, lightly tinted, always 4 meters behind, never breaking formation. The license plate changed once during a traffic pause. That was the giveaway. We ducked through a chain of alleys and descended into the old maintenance tunnels beneath the foreign quarter. My safe house was long gone, but the tunnels remained. Built during the Japanese occupation, they were designed to outlast wars, earthquakes, and revolutions. These tunnels had cradled refugees, traffickers, smugglers, and now us. In the dark, she became sharper, as though the absence of light gave her room to breathe. She started humming something low, melodic, unsettling. I recognized the tune. It was a field lullaby we used in Kazakhstan to calm field recruits before simulated capture exercises. She had no business knowing that melody, unless she had heard it through me. We reached a bricked-off corridor that led to a water filtration substation, abandoned since the late 80s. Inside, I found a rusted locker still intact. I opened it and retrieved a radio jammer, a flare gun, and a sealed box marked S Protocol. My fingers hesitated on the latch. She watched me from a distance, silent. When I opened it, I found a photo inside, a blurry Polaroid of 6 children standing in front of a Korean flag marked with burn holes. She was one of them, younger but unmistakable. Where was this? I asked. She touched the edge of the picture. Here before it fell. I asked again, more gently. What happened to the others? Her eyes shifted slightly. They burned the ones who screamed, and froze the rest. I had read reports like that. I had classified them. I had believed them to be exaggerations. Yet the look in her eyes said she had lived it. The idea began to form then, that maybe this wasn't about escape, but about return. She wasn't running from them. She was walking a loop they thought she'd forgotten. But she hadn't. The agency wanted her alive for what she could become. A predictive engine. A human algorithm capable of restructuring foreign governments without firing a single shot. With enough input, she could replace an entire generation of intelligence personnel. But others feared her. Rogue divisions, shadow boards, whatever you called them, wanted her erased before she reached maturity. Because if she ever fully connected the fragments within her, she could override everything they had buried. At a rundown church on the city's edge, we encountered the first real threat. A man in composite armor. Unarmed. Eyes blacked out. He called her Unit Delta. She froze. Didn't blink. She whispered to me, "He used to give us needles." The man didn't flinch when I raised the flare gun. He simply stated, "Your proximity is causing neural bleed. Separate now." I fired. Not at him. At the ceiling. The debris collapsed. We ran. But she didn't speak again until nightfall. In an alley behind a closed tea shop, she finally said, "They're watching. They always watch. You're the last variable." I didn't understand. Me? She turned toward me, voice clear. "They built me on you. I am the echo of your design. If I stay near you too long, I overwrite. But if I leave, I fracture." I had no answer. Only questions. How many versions of me had she memorized? How much of her was me? And how much had already moved beyond the blueprint I once represented? We traveled west, toward Giala. The old demilitarized communications bunker sat beneath a rice field guarded by fences no one questioned. Inside, ancient servers hummed, older than the internet, still functional, analog and fireproof. She activated one terminal with her voice. The screen lit up. A line of text appeared. "Echo reconnect?" She didn't type. She just stared. And then, from the speaker, a child's voice. "You weren't the only one." I felt something in my chest, familiar and cruel. There were more. Some still alive. Some not entirely. She whispered, "They're calling. The ones that made it through." I sat beside her and for the first time since the fire, placed my hand on her shoulder. "You're not a tool," I said. "You're the last page in a book no one wanted to finish. But you're not alone." She looked at me then. Not as a copy. Not as a weapon. But as a child. The girl sat by the small fire that night, her eyes locked on the dancing shadows. She didn't say a word, didn't hum, didn't blink. Instead, she traced the veins of a dried leaf between her fingers, like they held the truth to something she'd forgotten. I watched her from across the flame, arms crossed, the old ache in my shoulder flaring up in the cold. She looked smaller than she had a day ago, even with my old Korean field coat wrapped around her like a shroud. And in that moment, something inside me turned. It had been years since I'd let someone that close. Maybe decades. But something about the silence she carried, the way she didn't reach for comfort, didn't cry out in sleep, didn't flinch at the distant sounds of the city, it echoed the kind of damage that doesn't heal with time. I recognized that kind of quiet. It wasn't peace. It was survival. And for the first time since the fire, I realized I didn't just want to protect her. I needed to. Her name still hadn't come. I had taken to calling her Sun in my head. Not because she was bright or warm, but because she was the last light I saw when I closed my eyes. That name felt fitting, so I kept it. That night, I found myself pulling an old photo from a rusted tin case buried deep in my pack. It was faded, wrinkled at the edges. My daughter, smiling with that crooked little grin she'd inherited from her mother. She would have been about this girl's age now, had she not been taken in the Red Forest years ago. My chest tightened as I slipped the photo back. I couldn't keep the memory too close. Not yet. I thought about telling her more about who I was, what I'd done. But part of me still carried the poison of that one night. They'd called it a neutralization op. Standard protocol. I was told the building housed rebels, insurgents, enemies of the state. They sent me in with a single directive: burn it to the ground. No survivors, no questions. Just coordinates, confirmation codes, and a trail of bodies. The house sat at the edge of a district slated for development. I remember the rain that night, a steady mist that made the alleyways gleam like oil slicks. I crept in through the kitchen. I laid a trail of gasoline through the hallways, under the beds, along the creaking staircase. I left without lighting a match. I waited 3 blocks away and fired a flare into the night sky, a signal to the spotters on the ridge. 10 seconds later, the sky glowed orange. No screams, no alarms, just the dull roar of heat devouring old wood and plaster. I thought it was done. Another mission, another line scratched off the list. Years later, long after I'd abandoned my handlers and buried my name, I saw the report. A friend in archives passed it to me in silence. Inside, testimonies, photographs, reports. The building had been a shelter for homeless children, run covertly by a network of underground teachers and nurses who had been branded as traitors for refusing to surrender their land. I read the casualty list. 37 children. No names. Just numbers. Ages ranged from 4 to 15. The oldest was deaf. The youngest had been found curled around her brother's charred bones. They had died so that men with tailored suits and bloodless hands could build a row of casinos. The paperwork showed the land was sold 3 days after the operation, transferred under shell corporations linked to oil barons and political investors. That night, I sharpened my blade. I unearthed the wooden box buried outside a Buddhist temple in Jeolla, a safe site I hadn't touched in years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and padded with old maps, was my katana. Forged in Kyoto, 1948. Originally belonged to a war profiteer who sold children to medical research labs. I took it from his collection after slicing off his fingers and forcing him to write a confession in his own blood. The steel was blackened with time, but it still gleamed when the light caught it just right. The grip was wrapped in sharkskin, hardened by decades of blood and salt. I ran a whetstone along its edge for hours, whispering old names with every stroke. The blade hummed, not literally, but I felt it in my chest. A resonance, like it remembered. My gear stayed simple: field coat, double-stitched Korean canvas. No brand, no rank. Just weight and scars. My boots were old Polish paratrooper issue. Reinforced soles, silent tread. My shirt, black, breathable, tight to the skin. No room for fray. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. The first target was a chairman, the man who had signed off on the building's redevelopment contract. He slept alone in a penthouse wrapped in soundproof glass. I entered through the window, cutting the latch with a glass saw no bigger than my thumb. He was pouring wine. He turned as I approached. "Do you know who I?" was all he managed. I rammed the katana into his gut, twisted, and pulled up until his spine cracked. Blood sprayed across the windows, a black silhouette painted against the city lights. He dropped without ceremony. I left a single chalk mark above his bed, 37. The second target lived in Gangnam, protected by ex-mercenaries, men who'd seen battle. I let them spot me. They rushed the hallway. One came in high, the other low. I dodged the sweep, pivoted, and let my blade speak. Steel hissed through bone. The first man's arm dropped to the floor before his body realized it. The second took a slash across the thigh, then one clean through the throat. I felt the resistance as my katana split trachea from spine. They didn't scream. I moved to the office. The man begged. He offered money. I slit his belly from navel to sternum and left him holding his own intestines. Chalk on the wall, 37. The third was a woman, the PR face. Her lips had spun the deaths into a tragic fire, blamed on faulty wiring. She was harder to approach. No criminal record, no guards. But her hands were just as soaked in invisible blood. Chalk on the wall, 37. I entered through the kitchen while she was preparing tea. She turned, her eyes widened, recognition. She'd read the files. "I'm just the face," she said. "So were they," I replied. One strike, diagonal, her head remained upright for 3 seconds before slipping clean from her shoulders. I placed it gently in her own teacup. The fourth fled to Macau. I tracked him across shipping manifests and casino invoices. Found him boarding a jet. I waited in the hangar. One shot from an old bolt-action Mosin I had hidden in a vent. Through the knee, he screamed. I dragged him back inside, tied him to the landing gear, and fed him his own contracts 1 page at a time. When he passed out, I ignited the papers and watched his corpse blacken under the shadow of his plane. Each kill brought clarity, each death a weight lifted. Not redemption, just balance. When I returned to Sun, my soul was heavy with regret. She looked up from her notebook. She had been drawing, Not weapons, not rooms. Faces of the children. You saw them? I asked. She nodded. Sometimes they sit near me. They don't speak. But they're warm. I collapsed beside her. My breath uneven. My hands still trembling. You did what they couldn't, she whispered. You brought fear back to the ones who erased them. That night, we sat side by side beneath a collapsed bridge, firelight flickering on concrete. I showed her a drawing of my own. My daughter, her laugh, her curls, her ghost. She stared. She would have liked me, she said. I think she already does, I replied. Then she did something I didn't expect. She cried, not sobbed, not wailed, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks. Her body shook like she didn't know what emotion felt like yet. Like she didn't trust it. I held her close. Not like a soldier. Not like a weapon. But like a father who had buried too much and now finally found someone worth standing for. The world wasn't cleaner after what I did. But it was quieter. And the ghosts stopped screaming in my ears. I wasn't just her guardian, but she was my world, or what's left of it. If you liked today's episode, do hit the subscribe button and support the channel. The second part to this series will be dropped soon. Thank you very much.